Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I assume you asked me because I'm president of the Senate, but probably I should explain. Being Senate president is like being head of a cemetery company. You have a lot of folks under you, but no one's paying any attention. I should know better than to be giving any predictions about when the Senate will get the oil tax changes done. Weeks ago, I gave a schedule to the press and saying I expected the oil tax bill out of the Senate within a month, so the House had a month to deal with it. But unfortunately, again, no one was listening and no one was paying any attention. And making predictions in this business is pretty difficult. I had hoped to get the bill out of the Resource Committee early as well. Still, we were a week and a half late there. Time will tell whether I have any better luck in getting it out of Finance across the floor to the House, with hopefully a couple of weeks to consider it before the end of session, and finally to the governor, who has 20 days to either sign it or veto it. We want to get oil taxes right this time. We want the best bill we can possibly get, and we need one that can pass with at least 11 votes in the Senate, hopefully more than that. So I was asked how I thought the Senate was doing, and so far I'd have to say, well, the House hates us, the governor hates us, big oil hates us, and so does the support industry. So I'd say we must be doing something right. We must be doing our job. The debate is on oil taxes, on progressivity and decoupling, and it has been fascinating. Actually, it reminds me of one of my students after a particularly brilliant lecture I think I gave on Alaska history. He said, "Now that was marvelous, Professor. You know, I was really confused when I came to class. Now, well, I'm still confused, but at a much higher level." So, you know, confusion is not always bad if it means we can see new options, if it means that we can use new lenses through which to view the world, we would be sensitive to new pitfalls and intrigued by new visions. Still, I hope whatever emerges from this process will be simpler rather than complex, shorter rather than long, clearer rather than murky. Pedro Van Meer is a name I'm sure you've heard of, world-renowned expert on the oil industry. He spoke of the political climate here in Alaska and of that dependency relationship of Alaska on the three major oil companies for most of our state budget, as the lady mentioned earlier, 90%. Van Meers believes this creates a resentment among many Alaskans. And I'm not so sure if that's right. I don't think it's a resentment we have for big oil, so much as a wariness, so much as a basic mistrust due to an abusive relationship over the years. Remember Edmund Burke, famous British statesman, and his quotation, "Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it." Now, I don't want to dwell on all the abuses, but I would ask you to remember just three that have occurred in our historic relationship with the oil industry, so we won't repeat them, so we've learned something. Surprisingly enough, so many Alaskans don't know these events, or forgotten how important they were. I'd ask you to remember the Amaretta Hess. I'd ask you to remember the Exxon Valdez, and to remember Bill Allen. These three events are not the only abuses we have experienced, and I won't dwell on the many like oil spills or anything like that. These are just the three I'd like you to remember. Alaska versus Amaretta Hess. A court case found that from 1977 to 1992, the oil companies were guilty of, quote, deliberate falsification in computing the price paid to Alaska for its royalty oil. The judgment created almost $1 billion put into the principal of the permanent fund, and ended with the judge saying that we, the state, were guilty of inexcusable trustfulness in dealing with the oil companies. The judge said we trusted the oil companies too much, that we were guilty of inexcusable trustfulness. The 1989 Exxon Valdez spill was a disaster. I well remember, I know many of you do. Enormous damage to Prince William Sound. The Alaska Oil Spill Commission said Alaskans were abused. Alaskans were abused in Exxon's approach towards risk management, saying the company showed, quote, a corporate culture of irresponsibility and was willing to jeopardize corporate profits, unwilling to jeopardize corporate profits when it came to safety and risk mitigation. I was elected to the legislature in 2000. It was surprised to see Bill Allen and VECO employees so often in the halls in offices here in the Capitol. As we now know, some of our elected public officials were bribed, yet they still voted on the oil tax bill and even went to prison for their actions. So that's all in the past, you may say. Things have improved greatly. And I want to believe that. Still, the wise person learns from history, remembers our past. We don't want to be accused again of inexcusable trustfulness when dealing with the oil industry. We don't want anyone to think that a culture of irresponsibility is okay, or that the bottom line profit is more important than the environment or the cost to Alaskans. And we don't ever want to see our elected officials bribed to maximize benefits to the industry, instead of ensuring that the people of Alaska get their fair share. Now, the reason I bring these up has to do with the poor relationship developed over the years. Many Alaskans don't trust the industry. And that's too bad, because as was pointed out earlier, we depend on them for so much. Al Gore, former vice president, told the story of when he was a young senator from Tennessee. He had a big party in Washington, D.C. for all of his friends, and the waiter came in with a butter and was putting 1 pat of butter down at each plate. Gore looked up and said, 2 pats, please. The waiter kept putting down 1 pat of butter. Al Gore said again, sir, 2 pats of butter. And the waiter kept putting down 1 pat of butter. Finally, Gore said, do you know who I am? And the waiter said, oh, yes, sir, I know who you are, and I know who I am. I'm the person in charge of the butter. Dare I make that comparison between butter and oil? Prudhoe Bay belongs to Alaska, as does the oil. We are in charge of the butter, and we deserve to get our fair share. Still, we need to work on our relationship with the industry. That relationship is primary, since oil provides 90% of our revenue, and everything that comes out of that revenue, education, police protection, social services, Medicaid, are all derivative. I did want to broach one other subject with you, that's the bipartisanship. I'm going to approach the bipartisan issue in the Senate. As you know, Alaskans have seen fit in the past 2 elections, past 4 years, to elect 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats to the Senate. That's very important to a politician who's dealing with the Senate. And that has made an enormous difference in how we deal with each other. I think it's improved the level of civility here in Alaska. And I hope you can agree that our nation is in need of greater civility. There are lots of examples of politicians denigrating their fellow politicians, their opponents, crossing the line from honest disagreement to character attacks. As we deal with the gigantic problems facing our country and our state, the need for public officials to work together, show mutual respect, could not be more urgent. As we watch this presidential election, we see politicians stuck in permanent campaign mode. And we watch a U.S. Congress, what we see is so many votes that are cast purely on party lines. The time to govern should always be now, regardless of who has control. So the need for greater civility should be clear. How we achieve that goal is not. There has been some incivility here in Alaska over the oil tax issue. There's been name calling, and I really believe that has no place in this debate. We must respect each other if we're going to come together, if we're going to make the important decisions that will impact Alaskans and Alaska for years to come. When I was a child, the very first quotation I ever remember seeing and remembering was on the masthead of the Portland Oregonian. It was by Voltaire. I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That is admirable, and it's respectful of each other. I appreciate the governor's motto, show respect. We need to show respect across the board for each other. I know the members of the administration and of the legislature all want to do the right thing and are all saying what they're saying for honorable reasons, but it would appear that the Senate and the governor are at loggerheads. Still, we cannot let the rhetoric deteriorate. We both agree we want meaningful reform, but just exactly what that is has led to this debate. The governor's House Bill 110, which passed the House last year, was sent on to the Senate. It reduces taxes on oil by billions and billions of dollars, almost $2 billion a year for 5 years. For the most part, the Senate believed this was excessive and unnecessary. The Senate is working on a bill, Senate Bill 192, which would address the issue of progressivity. That's oil taxes when prices reach high levels, such as over $100 a barrel. This would reduce oil taxes by hundreds of millions of dollars, the Senate bill, per year. Now, critics have called the governor's plan a giveaway of billions of dollars of Alaska's wealth. On the other hand, opponents of Senate Bill 192 have called this plan the real giveaway because they believe the decrease is too small to lead to more exploration and development. A major point of discussion has been about how much investment by the industry would result from a reduction in oil taxes. The administration has said House Bill 110 will lead to $14 billion in investment, at least $5 billion by BP and Conoco, $9 billion by Armstrong. Like Ronald Reagan, I believe in trust but verify. Alaskans have been deceived so often by the industry that we have a right to say, prove it. Casual words are not enough. The Senate has questioned the $5 billion investment promises by big oil on several fronts. We understand it may take years for this investment to take place. We understand it may be more than $5 billion. How long will it take? Some suggest 10 years. So we give the industry $2 billion a year, and they invest $5 billion over 10 years. In addition, we've been told that 2 of the big 3 companies can promise us anything they want, but it has no meaning under the Prudhoe Bay operating agreement until all 3 agree. And we've not heard from Exxon at all. Further, 60% of the money they invest may be ours, may be yours, through the tax credits we give industry to explore and development. I met with the head of BP in Alaska, the head of Alaska BP, just last week. And he asked what he could do to move the discussion forward. I told him this was one of the major issues that needed to be explained to me, and I believe, to Alaskans. Lately, I've been asking myself, what would Jay Hammond do? Hammond was a constituent of mine for some 8 years, living in the Lake and Penn borough, and I treasure the phone calls I receive from him pretty regularly. He always said, he'd pick up the phone, he'd say, "This is your constituent from Lake Clark." Well, I always knew immediately who it was. He came to Kodiak to speak to a senior citizen conference, and one summer, he showed up on my doorstep at 7:30 in the morning, and he said, "What do you have to do to get a cup of tea around this place?" So, of course, I invited him in, we made tea, had a wonderful conversation. I'll never forget what he said, what a great Alaskan he was, and his commitment to the Constitution. He never tired of reminding us that all natural resources are to be used for the maximum benefit of Alaskans. What would Jay Hammond do? I don't think he'd be supportive of the governor's House Bill 110. That's why I like so much Kate Troll's article in the Sunday paper. If you read it, the Juneau Empire, she said, "What would Wally Hickel have to say about our current oil tax debate?" She quoted Hickel as saying that the industry doesn't own us. We, not they, own our state lands and resources. It is our country, not theirs. He said the issue at Prudhoe Bay is, quote, if we are being ripped off. Wally Hickel. 6 months before his death, he wrote, quote, meanwhile, the oil industry has and the companies that depend on them are flocking to, this was 2 years ago, meanwhile, the oil companies and the companies that depend on them are flocking to support candidates for governor and the legislature who will do their bidding. His words, who will do their bidding. Pressure is being applied, he said, to rewriting ACES. Now, isn't that interesting? Hickel was concerned the oil companies and the support industry in the last election 2 years ago were supporting and funding candidates for governor and the legislature who would do their bidding. We're beginning to see this happen already for the coming elections in August and November. What happens next year? If we have a governor who wants to give the industry $2 billion a year, each year, from the state treasury on a wing and a prayer, and a House that falls all over itself to do the industry's bidding, and no Senate to say, wait a minute, what are you thinking? Is this wise economic policy? The governor's $2 billion giveaway is a historic gamble with your money. He hopes that it will lead to greater riches, to 1 million barrels a day through taps. But you have to ask, is that reasonable? It will take many times the $5 billion suggested to even flatten the decline. And what happens in Alaska, to Alaska, if we reduce our revenue by $2 billion? After we use our hard fought for savings, which will only take a couple of years to decimate, you will be faced with the Sophie's choice of going into the permanent fund or reinstating an income tax. Think about this very, very carefully. Many of us are unwilling to take a chance on what happens if we give away $2 billion a year with no guarantees in return. Now, those of you who have been around as long as I have, and I see there are several of you out there, you know that Jay Hammond and Wally Hickel disagreed on a lot of things, a real lot of things. But they did agree on the Constitution and using our commonly owned resources for the maximum benefits of Alaskans. You need to pay attention to this and see what happens in the next election. I've heard some folks say they're not concerned if this legislature does not amend ACEs because next year they plan on having a much friendlier Senate, more likely to do their bidding. I think Governor Hickel may have been onto something. Watch out, pay attention. Now, I'm not an expert on oil, I'm a college professor, history professor. I may understand education to some extent. I know the education community will never come to the legislature and say, please, no more money. We've got enough. Educators always want to help kids to improve their futures, to add more programs that cost just a little bit more money. The same is true of the oil industry. They're never going to say, stop with the tax cuts. Don't reduce our taxes anymore. Save some for yourselves. No, never, not, nay. They will not say that, nor should we expect them to. They are corporations that exist to make a profit, to reward their shareholders. They will always support the bill that gives them the greatest tax cuts. That should not be a surprise to any of us in this room. It does seem a little disingenuous for the governor to say his bill is superior because the industry supports his bill more than they support the Senate bill. And they're willing to say they will do more exploration under House Bill 110 than under Senate Bill 192. The industry likes his bill better. The governor gives them billions in tax cuts, his bill. Ours will give them hundreds of millions. Of course the industry likes his bill better than ours. They will never support the bill giving them less of a tax cut. Again, does that surprise anyone? Like my experience with educators, they will never say, don't give us more money. They will always say, like educators, this is a good start. Just as the oil industry has supported the governor's bill and not the Senate's, just as the industry has said, even about the governor's bill, that it's a good start. And like the orphans in Oliver Twist, they want more. It is interesting how the arguments have changed this year compared to last year. The supporters of House Bill 110 last year used a couple of arguments they've since dropped. One was that high oil taxes were causing a loss of jobs in the oil industry. The former commissioner of labor, and I'm not sure why he's former, pretty much shot a hole in that argument by showing there are almost as many oil industry jobs now as ever here in Alaska. But unfortunately, they're not going to you. They're not going to Alaskans. The industry is hiring more outsiders every year. The second argument used last year had to do with the belief that the pipeline would be torn out in a decade. I'm sure you heard that. Several people said in a decade it's going to be torn out. Like Chicken Little, we were told the sky is falling. It isn't. It wasn't. Judge Sharon Gleason torpedoed that argument in her court decision on the value of the pipeline. She quoted BP's testimony to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You can lie to me, a state senator, You cannot lie to the Securities and Exchange Commission or you go to prison. She quoted BP's comments to the Securities and Exchange Commission. She wrote that the pipeline will be around for 50 to 100 years and clearly said, if today we had no pipeline, it would be worth it to build a new one just to access the known reserves at Prudhoe Bay. Isn't that a remarkable thing? If there was no pipeline today, it'd be worth it to build a new one just to access the known reserves. Now, Prudhoe Bay is one of the greatest oil fields in America, but it is a mature field. And all mature fields show decline. It's natural. The easiest oil has already been taken. We all want to halt that decline. We all want more oil in the pipeline to ensure that TAPS lasts for 100 years. So let me talk about what should be in the bill. In the Senate bill, first, progressivity. We have to refine the modeling to see the impact on revenue to the state and profit to the industry. But I think when oil prices reach $100 and up, we need to share more with the industry, maybe freeze the percentage of government take at a specific level. The total government take should not be the highest in the world, nor should it be the lowest. Let's try for just right, for something in the middle. We need to establish a floor to make sure there is some state funding at low prices, because you see, we still continue to fund credits. And if we fund credits and we're not getting any money at $10 a barrel, whatever it might be, then we're going to be in a world of hurt as a state. We need an increased production. We need new oil in the pipeline. And so I think we need to talk about a tax reduction for new oil production. Decoupling, probably heard enough about that, but that's the idea of separating oil and gas taxes. We may need to think about that. And information on capital expenditures from the industry are also important. So I'd like to see us lower progressivity at higher tax rates because it will attract more investment, it will increase oil in the pipeline, it will extend the life of TAPS. Of course, the devil is in the details, and I'm anxiously awaiting the debate that's taking place now in Senate Finance. Well, let me bring this talk to an end. A friend once introduced me by saying, I didn't need an introduction, what I needed was a conclusion. So I want to thank you for allowing me to address you today, for your tolerance and letting me speak in a pretty disjointed way. But there may be a theme in here. The political climate in the legislature, the historical relationship between the oil industry and the state, lessons to be learned from former governors Hammond and Hickel, the impact of civility and incivility in politics, and the problems we face in rewriting oil taxes. But if you remember nothing else about this talk, just remember this. We are Alaskans, and we are the ones passing out the butter. Thank you.